I will say this, we're from the state of Iowa, and in Iowa, the cut score is 41, and so this is, we understand, among the highest cut scores in the nation, and so it makes, I think, retakes for us a little bit more interesting. We're in our first year of full implementation, and so we'll talk about what that process is going to be.
My name's Lisa Palmer. I'm the edTPA coordinator at Illinois State, and I always joke around because you have to in this job or you'll just kind of cry sometimes. And I joke around that I wish when we started talking about retakes 4 years ago, we were talking about it all in theory. And my plan was that we would always talk about it in theory and never have to practice retakes. And I am so sad to say I was wrong. And so we have facilitated many retakes, and we'll talk about what that is.
Hi, I'm Angela Thompson. I'm a professor in the mathematics department at Governor State University, and I'm also the edTPA coordinator for all of our programs. And so I have 12 edTPA assessment handbooks that I need to have memorized to help all those candidates through. And you'll hear some of my responses in a little bit. I'm going to pass it on.
Hi everyone, I'm Carrie Gogolji-Seng, and I'm also from the University of Iowa. I'm a faculty member in elementary education, and my colleague and I, Will, are both from the university, and he is actually what you failed to say, he's the edTPA coordinator for all of our secondary programs, and I'm the coordinator for our elementary program, because our elementary program is over half of actually our whole teacher education program. So yes, we have our cut score is 41, and we're just in our first year of implementation, and so we have some very interesting stories, as you can imagine, since Iowa went ahead and just came out and said we're going to do a full 41 right away.
And I'm Lance Kilpatrick from Olivet Nazarene University, and I'll facilitate the panel, but I'll also offer the expertise that I have from our university. I'm the edTPA coordinator. We're about a mid-sized school, and every semester we have 1 or 2 candidates that fall into this category. And I'll tell you more about that as we begin. So to start us off, I've got our first question for our panelists today, and I'll let them just decide who wants to start us off first. But the question is, describe some of the instances at your institution when a candidate has failed or received a condition code, and then can you tell us what went wrong with the candidate's initial submission?
Okay, so I have one right now that I'm working with, and I think one of the surprising things for me at this point is some of what we would normally say are stellar or our best students, right? Whatever that really means, I guess. But when you're looking at GPAs or you're looking at, our grade point, some of these students have struggled the most with edTPA for us, and we have found this to be really challenging because, for example, this one student that I'm working with right now, her first response to me was, I've never failed anything in my life. There's no way that they could be scoring these equitably. I'm quoting what she said. So what went wrong? I think, we are still in the process. Iowa is collecting data and analyzing data. Our N, even after the end of this year, should be pretty large or pretty big, because we're a Big Ten university. We have quite a few students, where we can mine through this data and try to really pinpoint some things that are going wrong or things that we can improve upon. So that's good for us in that sense. So we're still kind of trying to figure that out. I think for me right now, because obviously we're all in this for students, one of the first things that I am trying to do right now is to shall I say, calm students down, because they're panicked. This is tied to licensure for us. If they do not meet this 41, they do not get recommendation for licensure. They can graduate, but as we all know, a degree in elementary education without a license is pretty pointless. So So I think right now we're still trying to mine through that data and like pinpoint particular rubrics where we need to go back into our methods courses in particular and try to reevaluate some of our signature assignments that we're having them do to give them more practice in demonstrating some of the competencies and some of the prompts that they're requiring for edTPA. That was a really long-winded response, wasn't it?
Yes. No, I'm sorry, Lisa.
So that's a very interesting question that all of the faculty asks because here I am off in the math department and people want to know, why didn't my candidate pass? Do I need to yell at her? Should I punish her? But here are some characteristics that I've noticed is true of all the candidates who don't pass in our institution. And there's been maybe 1 or 2 per semester, and we're a very small program, so that actually feels like a lot. They're very surprised. That's one of the characteristics. They thought they were going to pass. They were very surprised by the required scope of the responses. They thought they could answer that question prompt in 1 sentence, and what we were looking for was a page. Secondly, they procrastinate. The ones who don't pass, they think they're going to be able to do it all in 1 weekend, and I tell them from way before they even arrive at student teaching, if you try to write the whole thing in 1 weekend, the scorer can tell, and you won't pass. And the third thing is, their submissions for those who don't pass are not sufficiently detailed. So, we have to keep reminding candidates that the scorer has never met you, won't meet you, doesn't know anything about the rest of your practice, your curriculum, or anything, or even your state. We don't know where you're at. So you've got to give us all the information. And then the fourth one is that candidates who don't pass for us are frequently spread too thin. We do have student teachers that are concurrently taking a class. We tell them not to, but some of them do it anyway. They have families, run a business, have a job during student teaching. And it doesn't work out very well.
Just to give you some perspective, so we graduate about 800 program completers a year. So we have an initial pass rate around 97%, but that also means that this year we'll facilitate about 40 retakes at ISU. So just looking at this semester, for example, we have about almost a 50-50 split between condition codes and actual all-out failures. So our condition codes, we have seen a lot lately, and I don't know why this one has popped up. We've only had 1 in the past, but I've had like 5 or 6 now, of the G10 code. And if you don't know what the G10 code is, that means in task 3, their student work samples, the assessment they chose, is a group project, not individual work. And it's very clear in the handbook you can't do that. We've talked to students about that over and over again, so we've seen a lot of that one. We've seen a lot of uploading the wrong document. And when you upload the wrong document, you do not provide the evidence needed. So there's kind of, we talk, and we use live text to submit. So it happens during the sorting step of live text. But edTPA requires them to open and check everything to make sure it is the right document. So they're not checking during the submission process like they should, or they submit the wrong version of the document. So they submit one that is missing a key instructional material that they refer to over and over again. I've seen this a little bit. I score for secondary science. I've seen this a little bit in the submissions. I've had to send a couple where they're talking about, for example, a lab handout. The lab handout is not provided in the assessments or in the instructional materials. I, as a scorer, then I can't credit that, and I have to send it for a condition code because it's missing a piece of information with that. My ones that have failed, and this latest round I haven't analyzed their portfolios yet, but earlier this spring, there were quite a few of them that didn't answer the question. They just kind of wrote what they wanted to. And they're not looking at the rubrics. And we really emphasize that the rubrics are the answer key. We give them an alignment chart of what rubrics go with what particular prompts and what's the evidence there. And they're not using that as the guide. And I'm like, why would you not use the answer key to an assessment as you create your product? So we have that. I do have to say, in concurrence with Angela, most of the time when students come into my office for retakes, there are 3 big reasons why we're seeing. One is procrastination. One is they blew it off. And that's often when they have a job already lined up. And we have to go through the conversation of, and I usually have this conversation when I'm doing orientation sessions, because at that point, the candidate does not need to hear me reiterate what they already know, that they cannot enter that job until they get licensed. So they don't need to hear that, but we talk a lot in orientation about you need to, in order to be able to start your job, you have to be licensed. In order to be licensed, you have to complete your program. In order to complete your program, you have to pass edTPA. And there's a sequence of events there. The third one is they didn't follow our advice. So there are some orientation sessions where I run I have 26 different undergraduate programs, so I work in 20 different edTPA handbooks, and we'll talk about in your edTPA handbook, this is the type of targeted student learning they're looking for. So it behooves you to do, for example, in technology and engineering, very much behooves them to do some sort of engineering project, because that is kind of where their targeted student learning leads them. And they'll kind of be like, I lectured for 3 days, is that a problem? Well, obviously it is, because I'm looking at your scores and we have an issue here. So, and then we have the ones that just come out of the blue and no one saw it coming with that. And that is, it's kind of like, whoa, what happened here with that? So we'll talk about later questions about how we kind of facilitate that feeling part.
So, like I said, this is our first year of implementation, and at the secondary level, we have 7 different handbooks that we're working with. This year, we've been working really closely with the program areas and the student teaching seminar supervisors to make sure that they're doing a pretty good job of implementing the resources, the timelines, etc., into the seminar, because we're unable to be in 7 different seminars at the same time, and so our role is mostly more logistical. This semester actually, I had in the same program area, secondary program area, I had 3 condition code Fs, and that is the condition code that you get when you as a candidate are not visible in the video. So if you look at the handbooks, of course in the handbook it says the candidate must be visible, right? If you look at making good choices, it goes a step further and said the candidate's face must be visible, right? And so in this instance, I've done some detective work and realized that what happened is the student teaching seminar supervisor for this particular secondary area was showing some sample edTPA videos where the students were walking around the classroom with their cell phone, right? And at some point, that model student, that model video, they had an excellent score, ended up also showing or getting themselves in the video, right? But that point wasn't actually highlighted with these students. And so what the students saw and thought is, okay, to film, all I have to do is walk around the classroom with my cell phone, right? So 3 students got condition code Fs. There's really no way around it. We have to refilm. They didn't have any other film. But what this made me think and what I started working on is sort of a pre-submission checklist, right? That includes actually looking at all of the condition codes and making sure that we're really avoiding any of these things that can be condition codes, right? That maybe sort of can become a mistake without realizing that it's becoming a mistake. We've talked to the program area, we've talked to the supervisor, we realized sort of what went wrong there. But I think that this is really interesting, because I keep thinking, like, if I had known what we were getting ourselves into, I'm not sure I would have accepted this role at my university. It was actually kind of a choice, and I was like, yeah, sure, I can do that. I think that's a good assessment and will be good for us. But like last night we were having dinner with Elisa and sort of like talking about like how, edTPA really is a developmental process for our candidates. But it's actually really a developmental process for us too, right? You go from really sort of thinking about how you're going to implement edTPA across the program areas, what you'll do with that data, then you implement and you sort of learn along the way. And so I think one thing I'm taking away is sort of this idea of, it's important to be good to ourselves too, and sort of be kind with ourselves about this process. Because again, we implement this with over 250 candidates this year. And to have a cut score of 41, if we have a pass rate, nearly 90%. And if we were at the 37, is that what it is in Illinois? We would be close to 98%. And so I feel like, we're actually doing some good work here. But it's just a matter of really wrapping our head around how big this is. The three things that I notice is that, yes, we definitely have students who procrastinate, they don't take it seriously. The other thing, the biggest thing I think is students not using the resources, right? We give them tons of custom-made resources. And if they believed us, they would pass, you know? So it's really just about implementing these resources. The other thing I would note is that we have, you know, the 2 or 3 students in some areas who haven't passed have really been the students who have just gone completely rogue, right? They're the students who didn't share their portfolio or their answers with any peers during a peer review process, right? So we've encouraged all of the secondary areas to have a peer review process where students are looking at each other's portfolios. So they've skipped that, and they've also skipped or not taken advantage of, you know, a voluntary faculty review process. And of course, that's not the faculty saying, you forgot this, but, you know, sort of within the guidelines or the recommendations from Scale about the ways in which faculty can, via, you know, Q&A, sort of make candidates think more intellectually and intentionally about what they've submitted.
For our institution, I've got three comments, and I want to echo what Will was saying about the video, just slightly different. We had one candidate who received a condition code because her students were not in the video. So this was an early childhood education candidate, and the camera was set up on a tripod, and the students were sitting on the ground, and the video camera shot over them. Now we know they were there, right? You can hear them, but one of the requirements is they must be seen. And so she received that condition code and had to reshoot for that instance. 2 other candidates I wanted instances where they failed. One was a candidate who wrote with a really broad brush, just speaking very generally throughout her entire portfolio, and never really got into the specifics, never really got into you know, the evidence of what she was doing. So a really good writer, just spoke really generally of on every single prompt, and never really got down into the nitty-gritty of it. And then the other area where I've seen multiple candidates fail is oftentimes they don't have a really strong portfolio, but in task 3 for the assessment task, they choose an assessment that is really bland. Or it's an assessment that does not show their students' thinking. Oftentimes, if they have an assessment where it's like a multiple choice or like a pop quiz where there's just an answer to be given, they don't have an opportunity to demonstrate student thinking and to give good qualitative feedback. And really, they're just relying on the quantitative feedback. And from that, their portfolio, their task 3 ends up scoring really low, taking them below the 37 mark. And so let's move on to the next question here for our panelists, and that is, what supports are in place at your institution for candidates who do not pass? What happens at that point? Go ahead.
So again, first year, and right now we are, namely Carrie and I, are really sort of shepherding folks through the retake process. And I think that's necessary and key because it helps us inform what to do before we have to get to a retake, right? But also, all of our supervisors, all of our faculty who are working with the student teaching seminar, you know, edTPA is even newer to them than it is to us, right? And so for us, we're really being hands-on with the students, providing the support. We are rethinking all sorts of things, and so I think our edTPA program next year will be very different than it was this year. Different just in terms of how we're making supports available, how frequently we're sort of touching and, you know, and connecting with our students during the process, reminding them of the resources, etc. Now that we have data, which I think is also really important, we didn't really have data last year to go off of, but now that we have program area specific data, I think that our faculty will believe us when they say that we really need them to think more intentionally about the way they're integrating these concepts and constructs, and specifically the language throughout their program, you know, prior to the student teaching semester. The other thing I would say is that, you know, I think that data will help us really create a stronger argument for the students to think differently about this this process, to start believing in the process, because right now we still have some students, I think, who feel like their student teaching has been hijacked. I talked to a woman who didn't pass. She had a split placement, and the first half of her placement was in a secondary science classroom in Iowa, and now she's spending the second half of her placement in New Zealand. So she's having to, we have international split placements in a lot of our secondary areas, and so, that's tough, right? A split placement is already tough. Throwing edTPA into the first half of that is complicated. Anyway, all of that is to say, she just felt like the whole first half of her student teaching was hijacked by this assessment. I mean, probably if she had passed, she wouldn't have felt so negatively about it, but, I think figuring out a way to just make this sort of a more natural part of the process, sort of like what we were talking about this morning, Carrie, like not really calling it like student teaching, but calling it like edTPA. Like this is what you do, right? It's like just a part of the process or something.
We've been working very hard to kind of make our retakes very systematic as part of what we do. So our premise has been that retakes should be an educative process. So one of the things that we have really learned at ISU is that scores come to my office, and I frantically, it's kind of funny the day scores come in, because for the programs that are all clear, I send these cryptic emails that have like the little things like, score report is in, all good, we'll send official scores later, right? Because I just want them to know, you're not calling my office, all is well. So the later in the day it gets, the more nervous my programs get, because they know if they haven't gotten the all clear, now I'm working on analyzing analyzing what's going on. So when we get scores in, what I do is I look through for the ones that didn't pass. I'm looking up, what does this condition code mean? What's the retake recommendation? What's the why? So if it's a condition code, here's what went wrong, here's what they need to do next time. And so then I send those to the program, and the next step is actually for the program to meet with the candidate and to talk about, here's what we're going to do, here's the timeline, etc. One of the most important parts of that meeting is we do a what went wrong analysis. So in the task or tasks that the candidate has to retake, we actually go through their portfolio and we say, okay, for any rubric you scored below a 3, here's why you scored below a 3. In order for you to score a 3, you're going to need to do X, Y, and Z on your next submission. And we review that with them. So we take, as part of that, using an assessment to inform your learning, right? We're actually living out Rubric 13 right there in that, how do we help the candidates understand and use the feedback to improve their performance towards the objectives. In this case, the objective is to get a 3 or higher on all these rubrics, right? So we do that. Right now we're in a transition process where my programs are taking over more of the facilitating the retakes as the cut score goes higher. I can't handle all of them, and so I'm helping the programs with that process. Eventually they'll kind of take over their own retakes with my guidance and support. So we're working on how do we fill out the what went wrong document. We use understanding rubric level progressions to help us understand where we are, and we use the candidate's original work. On the candidate side of things, we have them fill out what does proficient look like. And for that, for every rubric they scored below a 3, we make them go into understanding rubric level progressions and identify summary, not just copy and paste, but to write out their understanding of what does a 3 performance look like in this rubric, what does a 4 performance look like in this rubric. So at that conference, we are talking about what you need to do logistically, so that's the retake guide from Scale. Then we are also talking about what went wrong, how do we learn from this, and then we are talking about what are the performance expectations for this next time. Because once we do that, and you're starting on your retake, we will give you logistical advice, but we will not give you content advice, because we're back to where we cannot do that, right? But once a portfolio's been scored, it is game on, open season, you can say anything you want about it. And we use that fully to our advantage. And we have found that when programs use this process and candidates follow this process, we have 100% retake pass rate, and we gain back about 5 points per task when we do that. So, and we've been tracking that, so it's very systematic for us at Illinois State.
So obviously, we're all here because we don't want candidates to not pass. And as a coordinator of a small program, all the supports are on me. So I'm, hoping and praying and doing whatever I need to for good luck as I'm watching those scores, refreshing, because if there's more than one candidate that doesn't pass, I'm going to be up all night. But one of the things that I've tried to do is to be a little bit preventative. So the first two things I do to support candidates who might not pass is to make sure that they have all the data they need so they do not have to get placed again if the school year is over. That they get more video than they needed, and they get more data than they needed. Keep all of the assessments, not just from the 2 or 3 focus students. Keep all of it, just in case. Keep everything. So, I very carefully select the submission due date. We have a due date. This spring it was March 26th. And I picked that date because if you made a small mistake and you were off by just 2 points, maybe 3, you have a chance to resubmit before graduation and make it. And if your mistake is bigger than that, then I'm going to be there with you, but you have that chance. And I let them know, that they need to keep all of that data. We make a lot of effort so that you can do your revisions without a new or continued placement. And that's really important for us. For those who miss by more than a couple of points, I let all of the candidates know as it's getting close to time for submission or time for scores. I said, you don't have to be scared that you're going to be on your own. I'm going to hit it like cheese on a pizza. You're going to hear from me, and you need to expect to meet with me within 24 hours of that non-passing score. That's why I stay up all night. I print every single thing out. I read everything. I do the scoring, and then I meet with each candidate that didn't pass the next day. That's exhausting. And each individual meeting takes 2 or 3 hours. And we go through everything. We make a plan together. We negotiate together. We're not really negotiating together, but I try to impress upon them which tasks they should redo. But I let them think that, they're part of the process, and part of that process is if you got low on more than one task, yeah, you might get a passing score by just redoing one, and that's cheaper, but how much cheaper would it be if you had to redo it twice? And if they didn't pass well, if they were off by more than a couple of points, we have them sign up for and pay for a 1 credit hour independent study. Because if they are not taking classes at the university, they don't get the supports from the university. That's why we do it. I don't want to punish them any more than that, but then I can have meetings with them. It's an independent study. They can have the library services, they can have the writing center services, and all the other services that they might need. We give them a student teaching grade of incomplete. We let them know, we're going to support you until you're done. I know that we're not required to do that, but we do that because I want to have them be still associated with the university. And then one of the things that I have to make sure that I plan for is plenty of time to cry. And it doesn't matter if it's a male or a female candidate, you need time to cry because your dream just changed. And I let them know I'm going to be with you throughout the entire revision process. As much as you need, I will be here. We only had one, and for some reason we've never had any condition codes. We've never had them. Hope that keeps up.
I think the only thing that, because they've talked for a long time now, so I think the only thing that I would, I agree with what they're saying, but my situation is a little bit different in that I'm also, because I'm faculty in elementary ed, and that's the program that I support, and one of the courses that I teach is the elementary ed student teaching supervisor, so I'm actually with the students even while they're doing edTPA, so I create our elementary ed timeline. I have them upload each task as they're going along through student teaching. I don't check it, I don't provide them feedback because you really can't, right? But at least I know that they are, I see from it, I'm making sure that they are actually completing it on time so that they can upload it by a certain date so we get those scores back pretty much all at the same time, unless there's something really tragic that happens in their family or something, then they'll upload a little bit later. So that's a little bit different for me, but I think one of the things that we have learned, Will and I have learned, particularly Will, because he does all of the other secondary programs, is that really it has to also go back to the program. We really are strong believers in that, whereas we're the coordinators and we do logistical work and we work with programs to look at data and to try to analyze kind of where they're falling short in certain areas in the process, really this is about programs. And we have to make sure that faculty in each of the programs understand that, and that they're looking at that data with us, and they are also taking a part of this retake process, because it's their program. So for us, that's been really, really important, that it's not all on the edTPA coordinator, that is also part, this is a process that has to come back to faculty within each program.
We'll take questions here in the end, and then we'll get through it. Thanks. Our institution is very similar to what we've heard here. We create it's a very individualized time when a candidate does not pass, and they'll initially meet with me, the edTPA coordinator, so we can go through and look at what went wrong, and then we also have a planning session and meeting with the program coordinator, program faculty member, and it's really small and intimate time where we're working through with the candidate as necessary, and a lot of the work gets put on the candidate's shoulders, and the program coordinator and the edTPA coordinator are just there to support the decision process that's going to be made. We've not yet had a situation where we've had two candidates from the same program fail at the same time, where we would have a small little group, but I expect that's what would happen if there were multiples from the same program that needed that sort of support. All right, we're going to move to question 3, and we've heard some of this, some of these questions answered already. But what common problems have you seen in initial submissions from candidates who have failed, and what steps has your institution taken to improve those areas?
Okay, so the most common problem right now in my program, hands down, is really not answering the question. So when I read through some of the portfolios of candidates who have struggled, I'll start to read things that they're writing that have absolutely nothing to do with what the question is actually asking. So we've already started this conversation in my program in elementary ed, where the literacy courses that they are taking right now in our program, they're great. I'm not saying anything bad about faculty in our program at all, I'm really not. But we have really nurtured and, I shouldn't say allowed, but encouraged our students during a lot of their writing projects in our program to be, to really just allow them to elaborate and be, use lots of flowery words and be really descriptive and have them, feel freedom and going off in different kinds of directions and doing these exploratory kind of writing assignments. That doesn't work well with edTPA. It's more formulaic, and so we're really rethinking some of the assignments and the rubrics that we use to grade some of our writing assignments in our program to really kind of hit home with our candidates. Yes, whereas you might want to teach writing like that in your K through 12 classrooms with especially elementary students, when it comes to edTPA, you got to read the question, read it again, really think about what they're asking of you, and answer that question. Don't start going on a tangent that has really nothing to do with what that prompt is asking of you, because that's kind of consistently what we're seeing with our elementary ed students anyway. That and also following directions, which kind of go hand in hand, right? The following of directions and reading the question and really following through and executing what they're asking of you. That's what I'm seeing right now for elementary students. We're definitely going to have to change some of our assignments in our program and the rubrics that we're using to grade them.
So I'm going to try to go over these quickly, and I'm just going to mention some of the common problems and what we've done. And the first one would be that candidates just are surprised by the scope that they were required in responses. And so one of the things that we are now doing is showing samples of a good response and a bad response well before student teaching, in their methods classes, on orientation day. The next thing is just misinterpretation of the evidence chart. I keep telling people that's your Bible. That's everything that you have to do and everything that you're not supposed to do. Everything is in there. Read it over and over and over again. So I just am bringing that up all the time. I make copies of it, I pass it out, we discuss it, and we still have a few problems with that. Third, misinterpretation of the prompts or the language in the handbook. And the thing that I did that really helped a lot, but larger programs are not going to want to do this, I set up an email listserv and every student teacher is on it. And they are all, every candidate in student teaching is invited to ask edTPA questions day or night, all the time. And then I answer to all in case someone else had that question and didn't know to articulate it. They didn't know they had that question. For each academic year, I've responded to over 1,000 emails. Some of it's a little repetitive, and so they see, I've already answered this question in an email on March 2nd. Here's my response, and I paste it again. Because that's a lot of emails that they're getting too. Their inboxes are full because mine is full. But that has worked well. Academic language seems to go very deep, and I tell students, and I told our faculty, they need to know more than the definition of academic language. They need to know how to teach academic language, how do people learn academic language, and most importantly, how to write about it. They have to know all four of those or they're not going to do well. So we've added assignments in our pedagogy, in our methods classes about academic language, and putting it on lesson plans, early and often. Talk about it all the time. Some of the faculty have had trouble getting on board with that, but I'm still working with them. Some candidates feel that prompts are redundant, particularly Rubric 7 and 8, because engaging student learning and deepening student learning sometimes happens at the same time, or within a few seconds of each other. And they think they already answered the question, and so they don't give us thorough an answer. And I have to keep reminding candidates, look at understanding rubric level progressions. When I score Rubric 7, I'm rating this from your prompts, and when I score 8, I'm reading this one. And I'm not going to go back and read that one if I'm the scorer. So that's just about transparency. And the last thing is something goes wrong early on in the edTPA and the candidate did not know how to recover. So they wrote bad lesson plans, and it didn't turn out well in the video, and they didn't realize that it's still allowed to change those lesson plans before you submit your final. You're still allowed to make revisions to task 1 just because you're working on task 3. They think that part's over and they don't redo it. And they say, oh, it's too late, I messed that up. So just transparency. edTPA does not expect perfect teaching. We know that. We don't expect perfect videos, but it does expect candidates to be very reflective, to know and write about what did and did not work, and to justify everything. Like Rubric 10, what would you do differently next time? So they have those chances, and I keep telling them, the video doesn't have to be perfect. What you write about it does.
Our most common retakes are task 1 and task 3, or a combination thereof. So in task 1, we often see candidates not aligning things to the learning objectives and not speaking to the learning objectives consistently over and over again. So for Rubric 2, how do the supports you have in place help students achieve the learning objectives? So we've really worked with methods teachers and in clinical experiences that becomes a really focused point of conversation. How did you identify student learning towards the learning objectives? How do you know students learn toward them? How does this assessment speak to the learning objectives? The other thing is, in each handbook, there's a targeted student learning. So if you look at agriculture education versus mathematics education, they have very different, while the rubric ones are set up similarly, they are actually have very different targeted student learning. Is that targeted student learning being utilized in the preparatory courses? So in other words, if I go into Introduction to Teaching Secondary Mathematics, are they talking about those 3 areas of concepts, procedural fluency, and problem solving or mathematical reasoning? If those aren't consistently being emphasized throughout the program, the students don't know how to speak to them then in the edTPA. And if they don't set up lessons that address all 3 of those, then they will not do well in edTPA, not just task 1, they won't capture what they need to on video for task 2. And so understanding that targeted student learning is really important and that you're designing lessons that emphasize that is really, really critical. So those are the big things. And then not understanding how to talk about how your assessments assess student learning towards the objectives and being able to speak to that throughout. So that's kind of our task 1 issues. Task 3 is a lot of not utilizing formative assessment. And our programs are getting much better about emphasizing formative assessment in the instructional cycle and how to use formative assessment. But if you don't pick a formative assessment for task 3, Rubric 13 and Rubric 15 are really hard to write to. Because students using feedback towards the learning objectives, that's Rubric 13, and then next steps for instruction towards the learning objectives are Rubric 15. If you picked a summative assessment, you have to be a very savvy writer to talk about where you go from there in a very specific manner. So many times with our faculty, with task 3 especially, we've done a lot of work in task 3. I have some programs that really have taken it on and done a good job. And they would say, we would have meetings about what the data is showing us, because we have an annual data summit where every year we sit down and look at performance by rubric and by task and overall, and they're like, well, we talk about this, and I'm like, okay, but when do the students practice it? Because if the candidates do not practice it prior to student teaching, you cannot expect execution on edTPA at the 3 or higher level. And that, some of my programs have really picked up on that, and they put assessment projects into their methods courses where they're looking at student performance by learning objectives in a quantitative manner. And then they are analyzing performance, and they're looking at feedback and going through those types of things. But we have to get to the idea that we cannot expect on a summative final assessment good execution and performance if they don't get practice on these things during their preparatory coursework.
The only thing that I would add to what's already been said is that because the students who are not passing tend to rush this assessment, I think it starts just like one of you said, with poor lesson plans, right? And poor lesson plans lead to sort of, okay, it tends to be sort of okay video, task 2, but then you really see the effects of poor lesson planning in task 3. And so I've also worked with program areas to really make sure that they're buttressing some of those assessment practices early on. Again, we're only 1 year out, and so basically what that means is I've said next year we really need to think hard about giving students more opportunity to practice. The other thing I've noticed is that when we tell students to oversample, they don't really know what that means. When we say oversample video, they don't really understand what that means, right? And the same is true for the assessment, because I've had a few retakes where the students were basically like, well, I don't have any other examples of assessments, and if they were implementing or doing some sort of formative assessment daily, with the lesson planning, they would have those extra examples to use for resubmission. So I think being more explicit about what we mean, the kind of video to oversample, and also how to implement more assessments in the lesson plan, and in the lesson planning segment, I think is important.
I think one of the things we're starting to emphasize is not every assessment has to be a grade.
Yeah.
And for some of we're getting to the point now where they're getting to student teaching, and that's not a new thought to them, so I feel like I'm making progress. That we can have checks for understanding and assessments that don't go in the grade book. And that's been a kind of a paradigm shift for some of our candidates and programs, et cetera, in terms of how you teach assessment and what you do, so.
We've done 3 things to try to address the preventive work before they fail, and the procrastination was a big thing. So what our institution put in play is an all-day edTPA writers workshop, and our candidates are required to come about 2 or 3 weeks before the edTPA is due, and they all in a room together, and we spend about the next 6 or 7 hours in a writer's workshop. We split it up into 3 different sections of task 1, 2, and 3. We have a little bit of enrichment exercises to help them assist, but for the most part, we pull them out of student teaching for 1 day all together, and we say, get ready. And we establish some rules for the day, and some quiet time, some collaborative time. We have time when faculty members come in to work with them, and that's been helpful. Another thing that we've addressed is understanding the whole edTPA. And so when they get started working on their edTPA, they're just focused on the planning, and they're not thinking about the instruction or assessment tasks. And so we have two resources that we've developed to help them out. One is just a checklist to requires them to think about the whole thing, and they have to turn that in before they start their planning task. And then another is an outline, so that they have to prepare what the whole edTPA looks like in short bursts. They're just writing about those parts of the task in short bursts, but at least they are starting to think about what it means to articulate their practice for assessment before they even start planning. And that's been really helpful for them to understand the big picture. We're gonna push pause on the panel right now because we're really limited on time. In fact, we've only got a couple more minutes before we're dismissed, and I know that there were a couple of hands up, and so I want to bring the mic around for some questions now for the panel.
Lance, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Based on what you just said. When you bring students back to this all-day writing day, do they work in program areas? And how many students are we talking?
So we, in the fall, we have about 16 or 17, 15 to 20 candidates. And so it depends. But then in the spring, we have around 60 candidates. And so we get a large room, very similar to this. And sometimes they're working within the same program, sometimes they're just working individually. We kind of let them do it, but the collaborative piece allows them to talk and communicate to one another.
And they have their videos by then too.
Some of them will have their videos. We ask them to have had their videos by then so they can write about their instruction piece. All right, we've got a question here, and
from your experience, did most of your teacher education students that did not pass edTPA, did they also get a bad review from their cooperating teachers as well? Was there any connection between those, or is there a pretty big gulf between how their cooperating teachers felt like things were going and then the edTPA failure rate?
Ours is about 1/3, so we have students that for whom not passing edTPA was just another indication that they shouldn't be in the classroom. And I would say about 20% of ours are like that. And then about 10% totally came out of the blue. And then in the middle, we're like, we can kind of see where this might have happened with them. So.
In our situation, I should be clear, we're still sort of looking at this, right? Because, for example, we don't even have those cooperating teacher evals yet for this semester. But what I can tell you is that when students have lower scores, meaning 32, 31, 33, anything kind of below a 35, I am beginning to see a pattern of mediocre experience, right? Not the case for students that are within a point or two of passing.
In middle school and secondary, I've seen the opposite. Because in middle and secondary, you choose one class to focus your edTPA on. And so those student teachers who just poured out all their energy on all the classes and all the students, they did great, but they didn't pass edTPA because they didn't focus enough time on the one class that they picked for the videotaping.
Yeah, in the elementary ed program, that's kind of what's going on with us too, Angela. It seems like there's been a couple who it wasn't a surprise, and I'm in contact actually every day with the supervisors via email, and they come into my office and chit chat with me about what they saw in the classroom that week or that day with our students. But there are definitely a handful that are totally pouring their heart and soul into the kids and into the classroom and building relationships with the administrator in the building and other teachers in the building, and then they're lacking when it comes to their score in edTPA. So we are still going to have to try to work on that and try to find this balance.
For us, the poor writers struggle. They're good teachers, but they may be poor writing, poor at articulating their practice. So they're good at being a teacher, they're just poor at articulating it. And that's where, and we've seen some consistency in poor and lower level scores with poor writers, and those poor writers we've known about as they've gone through their program. We've got another question here. This we'll hopefully get to our second question back there, but we are limited on time, and we will be back here at the very end of the conference to take any more questions as necessary.
Hi, I have a question about using the progression of rubrics, progression score. I don't know what that document is called exactly.
Understanding rubric level progression.
Exactly.
Or URLP if you need another acronym.
Thank you. Well, I'm interested in, we have at our university, which is National Louis, we have 5 different elementary, early childhood, secondary, etc. And there seems to be a little bit of difference in thought on how and when to use that particular document. So I'd be interested to take back to my colleagues some reflections about how you folks use that document in your programs.
For elementary, they start looking at that document the semester prior, going into their student teaching semester. So they take reading practicum the semester prior to student teaching, and we start having them look at that semester in reading practicum.
Yeah, we do too. I make all those documents available, all the edTPA assessment documents and materials, as soon as I find out they're in the program to get a license. In my secondary math methods class, we actually score a couple. We score one that didn't do great, and we score one that did better, and so that they can see some more examples. And for student teaching, when we get to student teaching, I tell them, don't look at that until you're almost done, because it's just too overwhelming. Look at it when you think you have a draft that you're ready to turn in, and it will give you some ideas how to make it better.
Okay. I'm going to have to cut us off. Yeah. Thank you guys for attending the panel, and would you guys give an end to our panelists, please?